Welcome to The Thing About Witch Hunts, the podcast that explores the history and ongoing reality of witchcraft accusations around the world with top experts. I'm Josh Hutchinson.
This is Sarah Jack. Today you have the opportunity to hear from Professor John Blair, author of Killing the Dead, Corpses, Vampires, and the Unquiet Dead in Medieval and Early Modern Europe. He is Emeritus Professor of Medieval History and Archaeology at the University of Oxford and a Fellow of the Queen's College, Oxford.
This excellent book goes deep into the history of beliefs about the dangerous dead, from the origins of the word vampire to corpse execution practices, to the striking connections between witchcraft beliefs and vampire beliefs across medieval and early modern Europe and colonial New England.
We love this book. You're about to hear about predatory corpses and many names for them, as well as sleep paralysis, the Malleus Maleficarum, shroud-chewing, witch cakes, vampire cakes, and what all of it tells us about how communities understood fear, the body, and the threat of the dead.
This wonderful dead on dead discussion even connects to the Salem witch trials. Thanks for joining us.
Welcome to the Thing About Witch Hunts podcast, Professor John Blair. Please tell us about your work and expertise.
Well, I'm essentially a medieval historian. I've had a long career working on early medieval northwestern Europe as a historian and archaeologist. My formal job has been an Oxford history tutor, but I have a strong interest also in archaeology, and a lot of my publications have been about buildings and settlements in Anglo-Saxon England and around. I retired 6 years ago, and I suppose that this book on vampires was rather kind of letting my hair down. And it's a subject that really didn't fit into my official interests, but has always intrigued me. I thought after retirement, why not do something different and actually work on it? And I found it both much more interesting and much more complicated than I realized, not surprisingly. And so I spent 2 or 3 years working on this book, which seems to have made a good impression, and I'm very glad to have done something outside my main field.
You have an interesting ancestor, James Blair. Could you tell us a little bit about his story and how that's relevant to today's discussion?
This is a rather strange thing that I discovered through the very good Scottish parish records and Kirk Session minutes. This ancestor, who was one of a family of coal miners, who in 1732, which just happens to have been the year in which there were a huge number of publications on vampires on the continent, had a coal mining accident and was pulled up from the mine dead, and was revived by a local doctor in the first known successful use of mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. And I had a rather wild theory, which may or may not be right, but I like to think it probably is right, that this very clever, well-read Scottish doctor had been reading the recent publications on the Serbian vampire cases, on the boundary between the living and the dead. Is it really possible to revive the dead? And thought to himself, here's a chance to actually try whether one can do. So maybe I owe a debt to the Walking Dead that I've now repaid.
It's amazing. We just love genealogy here, too. So when I caught that story in your book, I thought, oh, we definitely have to hear a little bit about that. I'm really amazed by your book. It has so much information, and I know that there's so much information out there, and then how you were able to put it together to help us conceptualize this fear of corpses is amazing. So thank you for putting your hair down and doing that. I'd like to know, what do we need to forget about Count Dracula?
When Bram Stoker wrote Dracula, he did do background research, but it was on sources of a rather specific, as it turns out, rather atypical kind. In the first place, there were the Serbian vampire episodes of the 1720s and 30s, which are very dramatic. They're very colourful in the fullest sense of the word, but they're actually rather unusual. It was the first time that that particular amalgam, as it seemed, between the Central European idea of the malevolent walking corpse and what seems to have been a sort of Caucasus Black Sea concept of a blood-sucking demon were amalgamated in that way. So bringing blood-sucking into the story, is not unknown in medieval Europe, but it's very rare. So that was one misleading thing. The other is that he drew on books that had been published over the previous few decades, particularly on Romania and Transylvania, which drew on oral folklore. But the trouble is, some of that folklore itself, it seems probably, has been derived relatively recently from literate sources. So in those two respects, he was using rather atypical material. But then, of course, he dramatized it. One way in which he dramatized it was to make the protagonist a nobleman, whereas actually most of the Walking Dead are ordinary members of village communities. Also, he made him centuries old, that Dracula is supposed to have lived in the 15th century, and he's still active in the late 19th, whereas actually the dangerous corpses are mostly people who died in the previous few weeks or months, or at the most small numbers of years. So in almost every respect, he got it wrong. He also got it wrong to make Transylvania the center of things, because actually, although there is evidence for vampire beliefs in Transylvania, they seem to be rather late and rather transient. So the novel, which of course has amazing dramatic power, it's a great novel, it blanked out the last vestiges of actual belief. And it also blanked out actually a lot of that had been written about dangerous dead, a phenomena of very different kinds.
I want to get some definitions out of the way before we get too far in. What are we talking about when we're talking about the dangerous dead or a predatory corpse?
We're talking about, for a start, we're not talking about ghosts. We're talking about corpses. And they're corpses that either get up out of the grave and walk around, or lie in the grave and exert some sort of power from it. So, for example, the idea of survival in right down to the late 19th century in parts of the United States, particularly in Pennsylvania and then in New England, that perfectly innocent people who died of tuberculosis, their organs, their lungs, liver, and heart were in some way spreading TB among the living. So they had to be dug up and the organs cut out and burned. That's kind of passive kind of dangerous corpse. We think of more, and certainly in many areas it is more prominent, the corpse that actually gets up and causes mayhem. It attacks people, it breaks things, it generally walks around the house and terrifies everybody. So I use the phrase dangerous corpse, living corpse, undead, which is rather a helpful term, which actually was invented by Bram Stoker, rather than vampire, until we come to the 18th century, when the Slavic term Urpir, which seems to have a Turkic origin, meaning some sort of blood-sucking demon, comes into general use in Serbia. It takes the variant form vampir, which is then picked up by the writers in the 1720s and 30s who get interested in these things. And then it's transferred into Central and Western European literate discourse. So vampire, I mean, it's convenient to use the phrase, but actually it really only applies to relatively recent versions of the belief.
Your book covers a range of cultures and eras, all having feelings about corpses. Generally, have corpses been something of disgust?
I think that probably in any society, a corpse is, I mean, she's obviously, it starts to decay, it starts to bloat, smell, so forth. A corpse is obviously something that is unpleasant, perhaps threatening, inspires bad feelings, dangerous in a medical sense, perhaps. I mean, there are all kinds of reasons why people should think corpses are not a good thing to have around. But it's a rather different thing to believe that after death, they actually get going and interact with the living again. And that belief, I think, is not a human universal. Freud believed that it was, and he developed an elaborate theory about how we really hate our dead relatives, and so we turn them in our minds into demons who are going to come back and attack us. I don't think that's true, because there are large parts of the world over many hundreds or thousands of years that don't seem to have these beliefs. But I think there's a human propensity to believe this in certain conditions, which are becoming religious systems that acknowledge death as being a process rather than an event, that there is a stage between what we think of as biological death and final dissolution, where the corpse can perhaps potentially still need special attention, like various ceremonies, like the wake, being watched. That's one factor. But the most powerful factor, I think, is stress, that it's a stress response. Like many other kinds of fear and paranoia and panic, which cause people to target groups among the living, whether it's witches or heretics or sexual minorities or whatever, But, of course, the difference is that these people are actually dead. And I think it's a variant on that kind of thing. So it can be, for example, disease. If there's epidemic disease, what's causing it? In a pre-modern world, it's frightening, not least because it's completely unexplained. How do we explain the fact all these people are dying? Are there malevolent forces that are consciously attacking them? Or it can be some kind of political change, like invasion, disruption, revolution. Or it can be religious change. For example, the societies that converted to Christianity and therefore replaced cremation with inhumation in Northern Europe. That's one place where, of course, cremation is hard to reconcile with any idea of the dangerous dead because the body is turned into ashes. If you suddenly stop doing that, and instead you bury it, people think, is it really dissolving, or is it actually still retaining some sort of power? So I think all these things in various combinations can lead people to have this belief. Once the panic is established, people start digging up corpses. There is a psychological mechanism that is, I think, in common between this and other kinds of extreme ritual. Anthropologists have studied extreme rituals, like, for example, the many societies which have rituals of walking barefoot on hot coals. Why do you do such an unpleasant thing? And the answer is that once you start doing it, the more you do it, the more and more unpalatable it is to think that you're doing it for no purpose. The more corpses you kill, it's a horrible process. Just think of digging up a half-decayed corpse, cutting it open, cutting out the heart, beheading it, whatever. It's not a nice thing to do. So if you do that, you think you're doing it for some useful purpose. If somebody tells you, well, this is actually completely pointless, you don't really want to believe it. So I think that's one reason why once these panics get established, they tend to take quite a long time before eventually they wind down and disappear. Usually, in the end, they do that.
You mentioned the cremation versus inhumation piece of it. There's a lot of ritual around death and burial. What happens if rituals go wrong in the death and burial process?
Yes, in some societies, this is very serious indeed. The most common and the weirdest mishap is if a cat jumps over the corpse. And this is actually so widespread that it's been argued that it's in fact a human universal. The problem with a lot of folkloric motifs like that is that one can argue that they're invented independently. But honestly, a cat jumping over the corpse, it's such a weird thing. Is that really something that the people are going to invent independently in different societies? Does it go back to a very, very early stage in human evolution? When humans were coming out of Africa, one can't disprove that. But in modern Greece, the societies that the anthropologist Juliet de Boulay studied in eastern Greece, it takes a very stark form. If somebody died, maybe they have actually led a very virtuous life. Perhaps they devoted their life to charity and good works. The corpse is lying in the wake and people are watching it, but then suddenly a cat gets in through an open door and jumps over the corpse. If that happens, they're a vampire. Nothing you do about it. They've got to, you bury them, but they've got to be extinguished by a ceremony which will actually sort of destroy their soul. So it's a very stark belief, and it illustrates how very important the process is. And an uncompleted process is the other great cause of fears of the undead, that they haven't gone away properly. The rituals for making sure they make that journey from the world of the living to the world of the dead, it may be quite a long and complicated journey. If they haven't made it properly, they might come back, and that's bad news.
That's very bad news. And is this sometimes an opportunity for a demonic presence to get involved and cause somebody to become dangerous?
Yes, and demonic possession is an important element of this. It does look as though some societies from a very early stage may have believed that somebody dies and then it's a kind of vacant tenement, as it were. And if there's some evil spirit wandering around looking for a home, there's a new corpse. There's some very interesting evidence from Mongolia for that, which suggests what may be very early belief systems. But the other way in which this comes in is through religions where the theology, like in Christianity, the theology is not really compatible with the idea of people wandering around after death. No formal Christian theology it will countenance that at all, and clergy know it. But then in some societies, the clergy have themselves come out of rural communities. These beliefs are very strong. So when their parishioners come to them and say, so-and-so died last week, we've seen him walking around, if you're a conscientious priest, you may hesitate to say, yes, that is Joe who died last week. We've got to get rid of him. You may think, actually, it's Joe's corpse, but some demon has got into it. Joe has gone off to heaven or hell or is in purgatory or whatever it might be. It's a kind of let out, perhaps, in some contexts, but there's certainly more than one completely different source of this idea.
And once somebody becomes the dangerous dead, what kind of techniques have been used to stop them?
So they range from the very gentle to the very brutal. So in some societies, attempting kind of exorcism. Interesting, in 12th century England, you can see a range of views, and the most up-to-date bishops by about 1200, they don't like the idea of mutilating corpses. They say, well, I'll write an absolution and you put it in the grave and that'll do the trick. If that doesn't work, you open the grave, you could just turn the corpse over. And that is one sign, though certainly not a conclusive sign in archaeology. If a corpse is face down, it may be a sign that they've been turned down. What you're looking for there is evidence that it wasn't buried that way initially, that it was buried the bright way up and then the grave was opened and the corpse turned over. So that's quite a gentle way that doesn't involve mutilation. That doesn't work. Well, you can take the heart out, but this involved cutting the body open, rather unpleasant, or you can cut the head off, put the head in a different part of the grave. Separate the cranium from the jaw, as is the case with some 7th century English burials, where it looks as though it must be trying to prevent what? Is it biting, chewing, sucking, or is it talking? Is it evil incantations that it's trying to prevent? If none of that works, the most extreme remedy is to take the corpse out of the grave and burn it. And there's certainly evidence that was done in 12th century England. But of course, if that happens, then it leaves no archaeological evidence. All you get is an empty grave. Some of these techniques are visible archaeologically, others are not. Staking through the heart, which of course is one does come through as used in Dracula, and that certainly happened. If it's a wooden stake, the chances are that an excavation under normal archaeological conditions won't find it. Won't recognize it if it's a wooden stake going through the rib cage. On the other hand, if it's a spear or an iron stake, and there are cases of that, then it will be apparent, or occasional cases, they're very rare, but there are a couple from Poland where the grave has been in waterlogged conditions and the stake has actually survived.
What role does sleep paralysis and nightmares play in this belief?
I think it does play a significant role. So sleep paralysis and nightmare in the strict sense is the sensation that I've never had it myself. I don't know whether either of you has ever had it, but apparently about 20% of the population apparently do sometimes have this. So the sensation of waking up at night and you can't move and something is sitting on you. And it's clearly a very distressing, very frightening sensation. And it's absolutely real sensation. The people who experience this, it is absolutely physical and real to them. And so it may be that you interpret it as demonic. But then supposing you recognize the entity sitting on you as being a known person, living person, or in some cases a recently dead person, it is so physical, you can feel the weight of this entity squashing you, pressing down on you, that, of course, it's very easy in that case to think that it's the dead person's actual corpse that's come out of the grave and is now attacking you. So I think that this is quite an important factor. Certainly in some recent cases, there's some, for example, the Philippines, where it's clear that a sleep paralysis episode has generated a belief in mobile corpses, maybe in many other cases in the past, which we can't tell. There's one extremely persuasive case from 12th century England where it's all described that the widow's dead husband comes back and sits on her and almost strangles her and suffocates her. And this is clearly a sleep paralysis episode.
Yeah, when I've had it, it's been a very real, you feel things. It feels your room lights up. It's like a 3-dimensional experience, but you can't move at all to do anything about it. And I've had a number of different visitations, but the witch, just a generic witch, was the most common visitation. It was like reading old witch trial records where if so-and-so came into my room and sat on my chest and pressed me.
That's fascinating. You're the first person I've actually spoken to who has narrated firsthand one of these experiences. But yes, I think one of the Salem trials has that, doesn't it? That a woman comes in and presses somebody. Yeah.
Definitely.
Yeah, I know as we talk a little bit more here, we're going to have some other very recognizable elements of these stories. The corpse and the witch are both physical entities. How is that significant that they're both physical?
Yes, I think that is very important. And it distinguishes them both from ghosts, doesn't it? Because maybe you can exorcise a ghost, but you can't actually physically attack it because it's not physical. And a witch and a corpse have it in common that you can identify them, you can track them down, you can identify the living witch, you can track the dangerous corpse to its grave, and then you can take measures. You can perhaps have a trial, innocent or guilty. If guilty, then you can do to the corpse exactly what you do to the witch. You can mutilate, torture, burn. What I've found is that on the whole, witch persecution and corpse persecution tend to be complementary rather than occurring in the same times and places. And I'm sure there's a lot more to be done on this. And I hasten to say, I hope I've laid the groundwork, but I feel as though I'm a bit like people like Keith Thomas and the previous two generations who first made the study of witch persecutions a serious historical subject. And of course, there's been a lot of revision since then. I feel with this that not many people in the past have really treated it in that systematic way. I hope what I've done is to lay the groundwork for people to pursue this. But as I see it, the places where you get a lot of witch persecution, like the borderlands of France and Germany, Belgium, some in Austria, some in Hungary, these are precisely the places you don't get much corpse persecution. And it's almost as though it's an alternative outlet for the same fear and paranoia. Let me just mention here another interesting dichotomy, going back further to the 12th century between England and France. In the 12th century, France had heresy burnings and England didn't, whereas England had corpse burnings and France didn't. Very interesting to reflect on that, whether the reason for the rather puzzling lack of heresy persecution in 12th century England is because there was this other outlet. And I mean, in that sense, I think the kind of the epigram for the whole book is killing the dead is better than killing the living. So corpse killing is a more anodyne and innocuous activity than witch killing or heretic killing or killing of lepers or members of any ethnic or sexual minority. So I think it is the same kind of response, but it tends to occur in different places, with one or two exceptions. And the big exception that is known to me is Moravia. It's now part of the Czech Republic in the 17th century, where it seems that an episode of corpse persecution followed directly on from an episode of witch persecution. It was a rather peculiar case because it was all encouraged by the cathedral constituency. The bishops were absentee and not much good. There seemed to have been some very enthusiastic demonologists on the consistory who, when in the 1690s they were finally stopped burning witches, it rather looks as though they thought, oh, all right, so now we can turn to burning corpses.
And I want to ask, when we're looking at these killing the dead situations, they're not necessarily done in secret of night. It's like culturally accepted at that.
Yes, everyone knows. And so it's, in that sense, it's a bit like witch persecution in that there certainly, just as there's a strand in witch persecution that comes out of the communities, so I think corpse killing does, there's less top-down encouragement than there is, I think, with witch killing. One consequence of that, of course, is much less well documented, because you don't have the formal trials, except in the particular case of Moravia and one or two German cities a bit earlier in the late 16th century. It's different in that sense, but even so, there isn't much attempt to suppress it either until you get to the mid-18th century. There's an interesting case from Poland in the early 18th century where some people are accused in situations of plague of digging up corpses, cutting them open and drinking blood and making blood into cakes. And they were unwilling to admit to this. They do admit at one point to drinking the blood, but they say, no, we don't make it into cakes. Now, the interesting thing there is that this appears to have come from a late 17th century pamphlet published in Paris describing Polish corpses and what you do with them. But the problem with that is that it seems to be plagiarized from a slightly earlier work about West Africa, about Angola. And so it looks as though these Polish noblemen and judges have been reading this pamphlet, which actually was really about Angola, not Poland, but it says it's about Poland. And from that, they learn that the peasants dig up corpses, take the blood and make it into cakes. So it's a bit like, yes, we know you went to the Sabbath and you worship the devil. It's, yes, we know that it's written here, that you make these cakes out of blood. And it looks as though they weren't actually doing it at all, even though eventually, by a top-downwards process, it does seem to become practiced in Poland. So there is a little bit of a top-down encouragement. Top-down discouragement, there's remarkably little. As I say, you get a bit of it in some 12th century bishops quite happy to dig up corpses, chop the head off with a spade. One of them actually says that's what you do. Problem sorted. Whereas the end of the century, St. Hugh of Lincoln, who's a major theological figure, says, well, no, this is barbaric. You should give an absolution instead. In the 17th century, late 17th century, Protestants in Central Europe, especially in Germany and in Leipzig, philosophers who are Lutheran more and more start to say this is just crazy. People are deluding themselves. Catholics by 1700, certainly in Rome, become much more skeptical of it. And there was an attempt by the Moravian consistory in about 1710 to get an opinion from the Pope, but he just refused to answer. I think he thought this was so crazy. But some local bishops and clergy still clearly believed in it. So the major episode of top-down suppression comes in the 1750s in the Habsburg Empire, when the Empress Maria Theresa, who, of course, is interested in the Enlightenment, is also a very devout Catholic. She hears about it and she says, well, this is monstrous, digging up corpses and burning them. She sends some trusted advisors to investigate. They report back to her and said, it's all natural processes, it's all superstition and misunderstanding. You've got to stamp this out. And from that point on, it does get court persecution gets persecuted from that point on, which doesn't stamp it out, but it does mean that it gradually dies away. Having said which, there is one part of Romania in the southwest, near the Serbian border, where it goes on to this day. And the most recent case I can identify is from 2019.
Wow. Yeah, I saw a video about one from 2004.
That's right, yes.
In
yes.
southwest
That's
Romania.
yes, with the chap brandishing his pitchfork, saying, look, this is the pitchfork I stuck through his heart.
Yes, exactly. It's remarkable to see in our time.
Yes, I mean, that I ended the book with that because he describes in detail what he did, and it conforms to accounts going back centuries of exactly the same procedures. But the thing that comes out to me from those films, and also various other villagers in that village were interviewed, was their complete sincerity. You know, they say, why are you bothering about this? This is what we do. The dead have to be dead, the living have to be living. You can't be half and half, and it's good for the dead, it's good for the living. What's the problem? And these are attitudes, they're probably dying now, but there's certainly still some elderly people and in remote villages that still believe this. It's worth adding, actually, there, that I think there's a big opportunity is being wasted in that anthropologists at the moment seem not very interested in this, but there would still be scope for an anthropologist to go to those Romanian villages. It's just time for somebody to go there and actually talk to the people, live among them, find out what's really making them tick and what other socio-cultural factors go with these beliefs.
Yeah, it is a really important opportunity right now. What do you think so the corpse cake, that really resembles the witch cake from the 17th century in New England. They take the urine of the afflicted girls, they mix it with grain, flour, they feed it to a dog to stop the powers or to identify the witch. Is the eating of the corpse cake going to stop the corpse? Is that information available?
What we know is from the Cavazzi book on Angola, that people in Angola thought they did. But the trouble with Pierre de Noyer, who wrote this pamphlet in Paris in the 1690s, so the original book is in Italian, it's paraphrased in French. He just hijacks that passage and just writes Poland rather than Angola. So we got no reason at all to think that people in Poland were doing this until they got the idea from their social superiors who told them that they were doing it, even though they shouldn't. And so from the 19th century, we do have some cases in Poland of this kind of thing happening. But this is where it's extremely difficult to work out the relationship between oral culture and literate, educated culture, because it's not a one-way process. It goes the other way too, that people write books about it. The great book published by the Abbé Calmet in the 1740s on vampires. If you take Romania, the clergy speak French because in Romania, in the 18th and 19th centuries, the educated language is French. So these clergy are perfectly capable of reading Calmet's book. And then when their parishioners come and say, we've got a walking corpse, what do we do? They say, oh, I know what you do, because it says here. But it doesn't mean that had actually been local folklore. It's getting cycled back into folklore, which is why I think that some of this late 19th and 20th century Romanian oral history is actually very misleading. It's an accurate and faithful representation of what people thought then, but it's very, very different from what they may have thought only 100 years earlier. And actually, on the subject of Romania, if you take the Moldovan bit, there is a quite thorough book on local beliefs written in the 1690s. And it talks about various kinds of spirit and how spirits attack people when they're sleeping and that kind of thing. but doesn't actually mention walking corpses. And surely, if that belief had been present in Moldova in the 1690s, he surely would have mentioned it, which makes me think that what is supposedly the heartland of these beliefs has actually acquired them at a relatively late date.
And another place that would have acquired these beliefs in later days would be what's now the United States. I know Pennsylvania and New England you write about.
Yes, that's right. This is very interesting. And here I must pay tribute to the work of Michael Bell, whose 2 books, Food for the Dead and the recent book on these beliefs. I couldn't have done it without his help, which is really very, very important. He's done all the groundwork on that. And yes, I think there are different sources. I mean, the Pennsylvania ones, of course, these are Germans, the Pennsylvania Dutch. These are people who have come from the Rhineland. But I was slightly complicated because at the time they came in the 18th century, these beliefs were not very prominent in the Rhineland. It was more further east. But it looks as though they must have brought them. And in particular, the idea of the corpse lying in its grave, chewing its shroud, thereby spreading disease, is a belief that occurs in Lutheran Saxony in the mid-16th century. As clear as say, that gets transported more or less unaltered to Pennsylvania. So that's one source. One source is Paracelsian medicine, which of course is a learned belief system that's come from some centuries earlier, and it's known that I think one of the people involved in the Salem witch trials was interested in Paracelsian medicine. And this involves relationships between substances, astral and earthly bodies, correspondences between things. So the idea that the heart of a dead person in the grave is having an effect on the physical well-being of a living person is perhaps compatible with that. So that's one source, again. But then a third source is just quack doctors, of whom there were, according to Michael Bell, there were a lot in places like Connecticut, Rhode Island, places where these beliefs appear. One interesting thing is that they don't appear in Salem and Hartford and the other places which were the epicenters of the late 17th century witch panic. Different places. There doesn't seem to be much connection. And it's interesting how those places seem to be notably free of these activities, almost as though they've purged themselves of this kind of supernatural fear. Rhode Island is the place where it really hangs on late. And the last exhumation there was in the 1890s, a woman called Mercy Brown, who's become almost kind of cult figure as the last American vampire.
Yeah, in the book, you do note that there's a possible interesting connection to Salem with one of the diggings through Elizabeth Johnson, who was recently just exonerated for the witch trials.
Yeah, there is that. And it was, in fact, Michael Bell pointed that out to me, which is why I put it in. And there are other connections. I mean, there's, for example, one of the stories it's from Slovakia from the early 18th century involves putting the heart in a box and burying it separately. And that motif appears in New England a few decades later. So, I mean, that is perhaps maybe another direct influence from Germany. I suppose it may be that some people who had direct experience of the witch trials, but maybe had lost faith in that because of all the terrible consequences of it, might think, oh, well, actually, maybe this is the answer. Maybe actually it's the dead that are causing these problems.
Yeah. One of the more ancient stories that maybe it's not, because 1703, I believe, but Mavia the Styx, I found that was such an amazing story, because is she both a corpse and a witch?
Well, this is the strand in Catholic demonology from the mid to late 16th century onwards, which does identify dangerous corpses as primarily women who had been witches in life. So there is that connection, which does raise actually one major factor, which we haven't mentioned yet, which is the fact that worldwide across many periods, the dangerous corpses are predominantly female. And it's not always, sometimes they're all male, but that's another thing that, of course, Dracula is misleading, that actually it's the women who are really dangerous. And that does seem to apply to some of the New England cases. It certainly applies to Anglo-Saxon England. In the 7th century, we have burials. Very interesting in the case of England, that the burials are mutilated in a very distinctive way, including separating the cranium and the jaw, are all female. But then when you get to the stories recorded in the 11th and 12th centuries, they're all male. And this clearly represents a major change in the role of women in society. So to that extent, the idea of the witch being predominantly female and the dangerous corpse being predominantly female, this is a strand that links witches and corpses. Various writers around 1580, 1600 are There's one called Hercules Saxonias, or Hercules of Saxony, who talks about witches who've died and they go on being malevolent after death. Now, this is the strand in Catholic demonology that is picked up in Moravia by this character, Karl von Schurz, who is the official of the Bishop of Olomouc, which is the place where all this is going on. It's an interesting and rather obscure little book. It's very beautifully printed. It was received produced in a very small edition because only I think 2 or 3 copies are known to survive now. And he presents it as a jurist for and against. And so you can't really work out very clearly what he thinks himself. But what he seems to be saying is, yes, this really does happen. There are cases of corpses, in which case you have to burn them. But hang on, we're panicking about it, that some of these people had no possible chance of doing evil in life because they died as children. Sometimes it's just natural processes. And he says, an old man came to me and said, my wife's caught in trouble. Should I dig her up and burn her body? He says, no, just say some masses. Get the priest to say some masses for her. And that does the trick. So he's sitting on the fence with that. And I think it's because it's a world in which mainstream theology, Catholic theology, is turning against both witchcraft and dangerous corpses in a way that Lutheran theology had already done some decades earlier. Catholic Church is catching up. And so the Jesuits formally pronounced against mutilating corpses in the 1690s. So what they're doing in Moravia is really a bit odd. And I think it's a peculiar consequence of a combination of their remoteness, the strong demonological tradition, the fact there have been these witch burnings in the very recent past, going very late, actually. The 1690s is quite late for witch burning on that scale. And so I think there are very peculiar circumstances in the Olomouc case, which means that there is this close association with witchcraft. But the Catholic Church increasingly turns its face against all this. And once Maria Theresa pronounces against it in the 1650s, the Pope then comes out against it. One very important point here, we haven't mentioned that. We talked about Protestant and Catholic. We haven't talked about Orthodox. And actually, after the mid-18th century, it's the boundary between Protestant and Catholic on the one hand and Orthodox on the other that becomes quite a significant boundary between areas that believe in dangerous corpses and those that don't. And it's one strain in this is the Orthodox non-belief in purgatory. So Catholics have purgatory, then Protestants abolish it. The Orthodox don't really have purgatory. So instead, there's this kind of liminal state where a corpse, and this is a very, very peculiar element, a corpse can be made incorrupt by excommunication. So you excommunicate somebody, and it means they can't move on. They're just stuck in their rather eerie, but essentially inert state, and called a tympanaios because the corpse swells up, and it just lies there. And there's one extraordinary story from the mid-17th century. Some boys find one, and they used it as a trampoline. And
Wow.
Wow. And so this goes on very, very late. But then there is also the vrikolakos idea, which is very different. That's much more sinister. This is what we think of as the walking vampire type malevolent corpse, which the church doesn't acknowledge, but is very widely believed in those areas. So that's what we got surviving in Romania. And it's what Jurij Boulay found in the 1970s in Eastern Greece. So it's in those Orthodox areas where the clergy were still complicit in it in a way that they were not in the West. And in fact, the most recent case in a Romanian village from 2019, one of the reasons it came to light was that the priest performed some sort of ritual while the corpse was being staked. And his bishop heard about it and was very annoyed and suspended him, and he appealed. And it was only last year that this was finally settled in the ecclesiastical court. So some of the Orthodox clergy still believe in this.
And how was it settled? What?
He was allowed to go back. Well, I've not read the full case, but all I've read is a newspaper report. But he was allowed to go back to his parish, maybe having had a slap over the knuckles.
Yeah.
Yeah, it would seem to me that if you know that a corpse is going to come back, or there's a good chance that you'd take some preventive measures.
Oh, yes,
Are there evidence of that?
That's exactly right. And so, of course, people are going to be very reluctant to believe those who tell them this is all nonsense, if they believe they've seen it. And the 2004 case, you remember that the man fell under his horse while he was drunk and died. And then a couple of days later, his niece said he's coming back, he's pressing him. So that's clearly a nightmare. In fact, he's pressing me, and she was visibly getting weaker. So this neighbor who actually did the deed, drank a lot of plum brandy, and then he went to the cemetery, opened the tomb, cut open the corpse with a scythe, took out the heart, took it to a crossroads, burnt it, mixed the ashes with tea and gave it to the victim. And of course, lo and behold, she recovered. End of story. And so when the police got involved, they were all very indignant.
Your research has really shown how beliefs aren't something that start and just grow, become stronger. They come and they go and they appear where you don't expect them. Was that something that surprised you? Or was it confirming what you expected?
I don't know. Yes, it surprised me a bit in the end. The difficult thing with this project actually was how to start it. And what I did was simply to take various general books about vampire beliefs and other supernatural beliefs worldwide, and I mined as widely as I could to work out which parts of the world these beliefs are recorded at all and which they're not. So I worked out, and I put it on a map. I had a rough map that I doodled on. And so patterns started to appear. It may be that because of this, there may be some areas where, if I'd mined further down into some of the older anthropology, things might have come to light. I rather doubt it, actually, because I think overall I've pretty thorough world coverage by the time I'd finished. Though certainly I mined deeper in the areas where it was clear that the beliefs of this sort did exist. Once I put it on a map, there was a fairly clear patterns. And in fact, the first map in the book shows what I've called the vampire corridor, which is not something to be taken literally, but something worth thinking about, where you have this sort of zone going from Western Europe through a sort of line from London to Athens, I said, and then going across through parts of Asia into Southeast Asia, where these beliefs occur. One geographical point that comes out of that is their proximity to places with shamanistic beliefs, to mostly further north, circumpolar shamanism, where, of course, that involves a lot of beliefs in animal spirits moving between the living and the dead, the shaman who gets kind of reconstructed, going on the soul journey, having animal helpers. All of this kind of thing encourages the idea that spiritual entities can be mobile, they can be flexible, they can move between different physical entities. So I worked out the broad brush picture, and then I drilled down into it and I tried to work out patterns across time.
Well, it is a marvelous project. Every page that I turned, I was really looking forward to what was going to be on the other side.
Excellent. Well, I'm glad you enjoyed it, and it was certainly great fun writing it.
Yeah.
Yeah, we definitely recommend it to everybody in the audience.
It's really meaningful to our conversations here about witch persecution. There's so many ideologies that have been applied to witch persecution that you see working in these death scenarios, and it's more light bulbs coming on. So it's a book that I will continue to look at and consider. It got me thinking about pamphlets and books like The Malleus Maleficarum. Oh, well, what did Kramer have to say? Did he have something to say about corpses
one
in
story.
there?
There's one story in that which comes from somewhere probably on the Upper Rhine, and it's a shroud-chewing woman that there's plague in a town, maybe somewhere near Lake Constance, that kind of area, where there's a plague, and then a woman who died recently, ill repute, is suspected. So they open the tomb and they find that she's been chewing her shroud, and there is, of course, it's being brought into a kind of demonological kind of context. So that's rather an early example of what becomes this Catholic intellectual tradition of demonologists who try to fit this particular phenomenon into their main scheme of demonology. Martin Del Rio, the late 16th century demonologist, is a huge book on the subject published in the 1590s. He has a long section on it in which he says there's actually no reason why damned souls should not come back into their corpses. There's also no reason why demons shouldn't come into corpses. Saved souls, no, they can't do it. But damned souls and demons, they can do it. And so it's assimilating it to Catholic demonological theory. How much that resonated with people actually locally in villages, of course, is another question. How much it's an educated interpretation.
Yeah, it really had me thinking about specifically like the Salem witch trials, because there was so much emphasis on identifying and then executing, but we don't really know. There's no story around their fear of them once they were hanged. And I imagine that's very interesting to me, that death appears to be the solution at that point in
I mean,
Massachusetts.
I think the answer to there is that people who had come to New England, coming from England, had come from a society where these beliefs had long been forgotten. So England had it. There was this epidemic in the 12th century. William Newbert, writing in the 1190s, says, so many walking corpses, it's boring to talk about them. There's so many of them. I'll just give you a few examples. By about 1250, it almost disappeared. And so the 17th century settlers would probably not have known about this belief at all.
You also mention in the book, you mention another earlier author, Burchard of Worms.
Yes.
And we know him from Episcopi through
Yes.
his talk about the devil and witches. And what did he have to say about corpses?
Well, he gives us this one of the first literary references from Europe to staking corpses. He says that if a woman dies in childbirth, a stake is driven through the corpse of the mother and the baby. And it's interesting, first of all, it's gendered female. That's one interesting thing. And secondly, the idea that infants can be dangerous, and that is an idea that comes up very quickly. They're not very often in Europe. It's a bit in Scandinavia, you get it, but not very often in Central Europe. But it's interesting he's writing then, because it's just the time when, the 11th century is just the time when you're getting these beliefs recorded in England. And also it looks as though there's probably an epidemic in Iceland. We only know this from the sagas, which are much later, but they do seem to be referring back to a period when these beliefs are common. So it looks a bit as though there may be a kind of epidemic of these ideas spreading across Europe around the year 1000 or just after, and that Burchard of Worms is picking that up. There are several suggestively mutilated burials of this kind of date from northern Poland, for example.
Is there anything else that you would like for us to be able to give our listeners about the subject before we close today?
I think the main thing that I would like to say about it is that, and I've suggested this at various points, is that this is not some totally weird, revolting practice that's got to be pushed to the margins of rational discourse. It's something that people have genuinely felt compelled to do. They felt that they'd been doing a serious job in removing a threat from their families and communities. And it needs to be seen like that. And a number of people, as I was working on this, said, how can you work on such a revolting subject? But I think nothing that is within the realm of human belief is off limits for historians. And it's very important, I think, that this particular belief system, alongside other belief systems from the past, where we don't actually believe that corpses do jump out of their graves or whatever, but we should nonetheless respect the fact that people in the past took these ideas seriously. They weren't pathological or sadistic or whatever. They were doing a serious job. And it's a subject that I think deserves much more study, and it deserves local specialists to drill down further into local sources and tease out whether the patterns I've suggested are accurate or whether they need modifying. I would like to think that my book is just a start.
Thank you so much, Professor Blair. Killing the Dead is one of those books that offers great context to fear, community, and the body in the pre-modern world, and the connections it draws between beliefs about vampires, predatory corpses, and witchcraft.
Please pick up the book at bookshop.org/shop/endwitchhunts and keep learning. If you want to learn more about our work on historical and contemporary witchcraft accusations, you can find us at youtube.com/@aboutwitchhunts.
If this episode was valuable to you, please leave a review and share it with someone who loves history, folklore, or the early modern world. It helps others find the show and learn.
We'll see you next time on The Thing About Witch Hunts.
Have a great today and a beautiful tomorrow.